Hello everyone, today we talk about Justinian's monastic reforms and the development of Byzantine monastic spirituality in general. We'll be talking about the church as well. We're naturally making a political history. We never made too much monastic history, telling the truth, which is bad because obviously Schwerpunkt is mostly medieval based, but of course there is also a more millenary tradition behind monasticism that should be properly interpreted century after century in its right context and time, but also in place, obviously. And so it's obvious that the reign of Justinian I is pivotal for the definition of what will eventually become a Greek Orthodox Church. This was still a big Catholic empire pursuing orthodoxy. More often than not, we'll see, because at least the Byzantines will have troubles with, especially the Eastern churches, whereas the West went on, thanks to the papal guidance at the top, toward much more orthodox directions. I'm surprised. I sometimes today will not do it, but probably we're going to digress on it to explain the meaning of Catholic or Orthodox. Right? You think that these are some confessional definitions of kind of different churches, etc. I think you are. You may be mentally challenged, or at least not particularly bright in strictly cultural terms. But this is exactly the point. Considering all the videos I made on the topic, I don't repeat myself anymore because the videos are already too long the way they are. And today we have an interesting chance, in fact, of defining better this greater ecumenic spiritual ethos that sort of permeates the eastern half of the empire, and under Justinian, in fact, it radiates further across Europe and beyond. By the 6th century, so during the reign of Emperor Justinian, obviously didn't last the entire 6th century, but obviously dominated it in many ways, as he ruled what was de facto already just like as a whole, the Roman Empire, not much a Eastern Alf. And so we can also call it Byzantine to an extent, if you have problems, more than issues or simple questions with this. I made multiple videos explaining why it is perfectly fine to use the term Byzantine from a strictly historical and historiographical point of view, regardless of whichever ideology you want to project on me, because you obviously, if you need to do that, it's because you don't know absolutely anything about what I teach here. I say this as a big disclaimer because every once in a while we have lots of people actually watching my Byzantine history video. I don't know whether this video is going to blow up as well, but usually, even for inexplicable reasons, the algorithm blesses them. And it's not entirely like the sort of the followers' taste per se. I mean, we all like Byzantine history here. We say the criticism of certain modern takes on it are a completely different thing. This is exactly the point. People who are not acquainted with our history tend to make this a matter of, we use the term Byzantine because you have something against, or you're improper or whatever. And the only field where I basically get this from still, even though at a minimal level, but still disproportionate compared to the virtually no criticism I receive for any other topic possible, and this already is kind of a major red flag from the other side, is Byzantine history, right? Because for some reason that I have in mind, and I explain in other videos, there's been this notion from in the past decades that if you want to act pseudo-intellectually sophisticated, you have to show that sorry, it's not actually Byzantine history. They were actual Romans, right? They call themselves like that, so you're wrong. So basically, it transformed itself in a nominalistic heresy. Most of the people who say this do not know absolutely anything about even basic monolithic history as far as Constantinople and its empire are concerned. But I always like to provoke, because this makes even more angst, generates more trouble, and for some reason I get even more visibility. But as you can see, if you are able to go past these introductions, the history we do is actually interesting, and there is a reason if these videos are watched after all. So jokes aside, Justinian's reign, right, from 527 to 565. First of all, very, very long. Justinian is renowned for his ambitious legal reforms. We talk about the so-called Justinian Code, there is actually a re-edition of the Theodosian one that was sort of widened and properly adapted to the 6th century context of also a renewed, a reconquered empire, especially a reconquered Rome. So that if you look at the pragmatic sanction, etc., like there is much that actually Justinian is legislating, not much as far as the East was concerned, but the West, in particular, Italy, right? But aside from this, we know that these reforms are compiled in a broader with a broader universal goal, the perpetua sanctio of the Saint Theodosius, in the Corpus Juris Civilis. Justinian, as we just mentioned, is most famous also for his military reconquests of territories in North Africa, Italy, and parts of Spain, that briefly, albeit successfully, restored much of the old, sort of the integrity of the old Roman Mediterranean world, right? Retransforming essentially for a couple of generations the Mediterranean in a Roman lake. Socioculturally, it may be misleading to say so, because Romanity was in any case permeating late antique culture, was still alive up to this point, especially Justinian's pandemic, and so there is all a debate regarding the exhaustion of the system due to the same efforts of reconquest. But here we're talking also properly direct occupation, and actually I believe that the reconquest was the right thing to do, right? And it also showed historically to be absolutely accomplishable by the Byzantines, that had been building up really a lot of, especially naval power. That is a bit the underrated aspect of the story, because yeah, everybody likes the wars of Procopius, Belisarius's deeds, and so we legitimately focus mostly on what was strategically, in any case, the most important land effort. But there is something thalassocratic about Byzantine culture that is very much here rewarding. In fact, generations of naval build-up that is also very much an Hellenic character per se. And this character, mostly coastally, urbanly, maritime based, will in fact remain a core tenet of Byzantine sort of political territorial foundation per se. And so you immediately understand where we're getting at with this, because of course a monastic reform, as the same etymology of monastic explains, is a reductio ad unum. So a truly imperial Catholic reunification in this case, in this moment in history, under a sole heavenly rule, right? And the monastic orders had to provide, in this sense, the very framework for reconstituting that projection of heavenly nature on earth. Right? This was the purpose of the monastery. If you want, it's a purpose of, it had been the one of the church at this point, but as we well know, on the basis of the same Romanity tout court, right? The Romans had been founding Romes everywhere. Every single Roman colony was essentially a copy of Rome, understood properly as a sacred space and of heavenly nature. And so it's imprudent to presume that we can enter the mindset of a 16th century Byzantine emperor, even more so in particular, not just the average shoemaker in Constantinople, so to say. But you get the gist of the breadth and width of this also spiritual matter at hand, especially with all the problems, as we will come back to now, that existed especially in the Levantine churches, as it had actually been prophesied from centuries, right? From the very first centuries of Christian history, if you read Hippolytus, there is this quite strong awareness of the sort of the moral weakness, in a sense, of the Eastern churches that will essentially drive apart, will be overrun by Islam, and will essentially destabilize the entire Mediterranean. And the same Byzantine Empire that managed to survive, but this had been properly prophesied within a pretty solid Christian framework of patristics, of also Christian apologetics at the time, which is remarkable because it shows how the Christians saw already some issues in very specific parts of the world that were characterized by a different moral caliber. so to say. And in the top 6 comments down below, you will find plenty of this information. Now, when you look at the effort at unification of Christian doctrine amid ongoing theological disputes, you have the internal organization of Byzantine communal houses, or cenobia, that had become a matter of direct state intervention. When Justinian enacted comprehensive, aggressive legislation to regulate them. And these laws formed part of his broader novels, or new constitutions, which addressed ecclesiastical matters extensively to maintain social order and imperial harmony with the church. Naturally, Schwerpunkt's followers are not immune to the obvious role that what we call, so from the Middle Ages, as Roman law, which is essentially the refiltered Justinian code through especially the Bolognese juridical studies in the Holy Roman Empire, is a highly sort of secular civil law that express, just like in the Theodosian and Justinian framework, the subordination of the church to the emperor. Right now, we are also all acquainted with what this means in the history of tradition. I also made lots of videos about the investiture controversy, and we actually observed how, at this point in history, much of what essentially the reason why Christianity had come about to begin with was the essential failure by the imperial authority. And so the official proposed to probably like the overall rule, because this had happened also through magistracies in the Roman Empire, of the Pontifex Maximus. So if you look at the temporal and the spiritual affairs, the impossibility, in fact, for a single person to hold both. Right? So Christianity the church had been founded on the basis of this premise, and different peoples try, or at least to preserve and to maintain this unity, and they actually end up sclerotizing or failing. Right? If you look at the West splits them because it rationalizes, saying, at this point humanity has sunk too low for being there not much for being there someone who can restore this unity, because of course papacy and empire were always part of a unique body, right? And it could have not been otherwise from an ecumenical point of view. It's mostly like a matter of the doctrine of the two natures and how these entwine in the relative officials that hold this power. But we will make them cooperate. All right, and this is the moment in which, in fact, Western civilization booms, overwhelms the Byzantine one, expands everywhere. The entire Western Eurasia revolves around Western power in many ways, really. And you see that the greatest failure in terms of eventual political stability in Islam, that goes with probably even not the recognition of a priesthood, and so with the idea that there could be a caliphal guide, could be the head of everything. The Byzantine Empire actually maintains something very it distinguishes obviously the church from the empire, but it subordinates the church to the empire, and this ends up sclerotizing. Saying that this is actually more functional. So as we were saying, like than Islam, for example, it remains chronically unstable throughout this period in comparison, say, to the Byzantine Empire, especially from an internal point of view. But in the Byzantine case, in fact, there is the impossibility of the church to provoke, right, to check and balance the empire, and so to develop that dichotomy that will make the West literally sort of take off at some point in a shocking way. If you look at it from a civilization perspective, you can't sort of make comparisons with our civilizations. Perhaps just early Rome managed to rise that fast and maintain such a great stability and inner coherence, right? And related to different times, because obviously if you look at the rates of growth, for example, just from a material point of view, say of the industrial period, this is uncomparable. Then it's still, given the material availability, like the result was pretty poor. And great part of this sclerosis, as we'll see today, actually starts under Justinian, and for reasons that, as we will learn, are actually sort of dictated by the circumstances there is a deep agency, but also a specific substance that, as we explained, in the East rendered very difficult to actually maintain a coherent and cooperative system that would not fall apart, in fact, in a matter of generations. And in the process also still fundamentally oppress the same church to a point of non-return in possibilities of autonomization, even as a general trajectory. Let's not even talk independence as it had been in the West, but always remember, in an ecumenic sense, in a cooperative sense. This divine standard was met by the Sebastocratores, at least in theory, with the church fundamentally, with the emperors being themselves like the vicars of Christ on earth, as opposed to the head of the church, like in the West. And interestingly enough, this was meant to exist within the same Byzantine Empire, as far as Rome was nominally part of that, and the popes successfully stamped this imperial power, right, and won from this sort of level of Western spiritual sort of thriving that the Byzantine will fundamentally never really understand. Right? Byzantine emperors were going there saying, okay, if the Pope does not obey, we will kill him. And this is what evidently also is not quite a great recipe for stability and integrity. And why you should also look at Byzantine civilization in terms that should not indeed distract from the great still civilizational accomplishment that Constantinople did, but the premises and the foundation of this, aside from all the proper influence and proper constitutional characters, like again argue from a cultural, ethnic point of view that were entailed by the state of affairs, right? And if you are not familiar with this interpretation, well, I really advise you to give a look to my Byzantine history playlist. But now we'll understand how this mechanism worked. So the laws that we were here explaining, properly disciplining the Byzantine Church issued by Justinian, formed part of the novels, the new constitutions, which addressed these ecclesiastical matters extensively to maintain line of principle, social order, and imperial harmony with the church, even though they turned into something very different. As you know, the Justinian regime was quite repressive in many fields, right? This is true look at the school of philosophy of Athens, look at what happened to the Jewry. This also has some echoes elsewhere. For example, Visigothic kingdom was very, of all the Western, of all the Romano-Germanic realms, was the most influenced by Byzantine models, right, in general. The issue of the Jews will be, also because there were many there, and they will remain throughout all the rest of the Middle Ages, addressing in very different ways from other parts of the West that also made it, again, very resemblant to what was happening in Constantinople. But we'll talk more about the Toledo councils and the Visigothic realm as such. Now, Justinian's intervention was fueled by ecclesiastical and monastic affairs, by the theological concept of symphonia, that is to say, harmony, the belief that the political well-being of the empire depended entirely on the spiritual purity and doctrinal orthodoxy of its citizens, which is actually correct. And that immediately also shows that this was not the case in the Byzantine Empire, because especially the eastern provinces of the same were pullulating literally with incredibly pernicious and quite rooted heresies. Right? They were not merely political expedients, as at the top they were also used by, but obviously stemmed from the peculiar national characters of local spirituality. Right, that did not allow an orderly spread, for example, of ecclesiastical administration like in the West. You would think, among the other things that we explained, but I partially addressed this in the videos in which I was asked whether the Byzantine Empire was sort of more advanced in the West and whatever, that the way, aside from the fact it was this was carried out by Rome in the West. But the way the Romano-Germanic kingdoms developed their own church was much more orderly, right? It followed a much more orderly pattern and pre-existing stability. That is often not what you hear, because you always hear that the West fell, so it was worse. Well, but what did actually happen to the West when what fell exactly? Because much of the shattering occurred much more structurally eventually, with especially Islamic invasions in the East, and for a reason. In the West, you have a contraction, right, an evaporation of certain statal structures, but fundamentally, especially ecclesiastical administration, had been spreading very successfully, and in this sense also very autonomously, because there wasn't an overall authority in the West. It's true that when you look at this period, that there is a healthy key of interpretation when you realize that the Roman Empire never really ended, in the sense, not that obviously enough, like the Byzantine Empire was the continuation of the Roman Empire and the Roman Empire itself, but the fact that in any case there was a broader civilizational role and might of the Mediterranean lands that continued, especially in the West, from Rome to pour out a staggering level of civilizational advancement, right? This is something that I think as Westerners we should recover. And in the moment in which the Roman Empire was evaporating, it's not like the church was shrinking itself. The church was booming at that point. And all the Romano-Germanic rulers that sort of lived at the time were actually facilitating this spread, the evangelization of Europe and also other peoples that had not yet converted, or that had not probably ever been under Rome, even though they had always been revolving around her, and in this sense also still felt somehow delegated from it in places you would imagine. Like, what do you think, that the Roman Empire at some point ended and somebody from the other side would say, aha, we tore down the no, right? This is not what happened. Actually, the crisis struck every single one. Great part of the reason why various Germanic peoples moved from areas that in fact got also replenished by other populations, settled in fact in the best lands in the West, whereas whoever lived in Central, Northern, Eastern Europe had a terrible sort of moment ahead and was eventually re-evangelized by Franco-Roman civilization, also in arms for that matter, but not mostly in an autonomous sense, even before in fact anybody, or like this is what happens throughout most of that space, actually, from a local point of view, and without invasions, without conquests. And this is a very underrated aspect, right? Whereas, as we've seen, that the Byzantine Empire does succeed to convert different peoples in the Balkans, in Eastern Europe and beyond, even in the steppes, but we're talking just basically like the Bulgarians, the Serbs, at some point the Kievan Rus, that was in any case very autonomous, differently from what happened with the West, where Rome properly organized the entire church and dictated not just the matters of evangelization, but of ecclesiastical policy and administration throughout all the rest of the Middle Ages. The Khazars. So if you look at this in comparison, this happened naturally centuries after Justinian. But if you look in this sense proportionally, how expansive the Roman Church was, and how already established a Western axis in the form of Anglo-Saxons, Franks, Longobards, was being produced at this point. Like the question strikes you. Like, actually, these powers, even when they were still into Arianism, did not produce any sort of theological issue with the church, and actually backed the Church of Rome against the shenanigans of Constantinople that was equilibristically trying to save the eastern lands by siding with or winking at this or that other heresy, and ultimately to lose everything. And to continue, by the way, after this, we think about the iconoclasm that was in part, even though it's a much more complicated issue, like influenced by Islamic aniconism, and etc. But again, these are all things we saw in different videos. So if you're curious about them, I don't need to digress every time, but just bear in mind that this is also a trajectory that sort of is deeply connected with what the Byzantine Church had already been established. This could be drawn back up to Constantine. I mean, Constantine got away from Rome exactly because senators and popes were too powerful for him to be dislodged. So he creates this much more manageable, as far as sort of commanding, obeying, not having to broker sort of accords, etc. Like he creates a senate of actually pretty mediocre people taken from some sort of pretty lower mold compared to the Western senators. He creates this church that is ever more, at least he allows for the freedom of cult, but in this sense stabilizes a church that is very much, in this sense, subjected to him. And so there is all a mystique of Byzantine imperial power that definitely follows a different pattern than the West, with this initially promising and sort of pompous way, but that ultimately is not going, if you look at it in perspective, to really play much favorably compared to the West. That again, I want to stress, maintains in the sense a much stronger spiritual unity than the East. And when you look at the concept of symphony and harmony, this idea rests on the idea that regulating the physical spaces of those seeking Christian perfection was a matter of state survival. And again, this was fundamentally correct, right? As we just said, the Byzantine Empire was incredibly different within itself. There was much more coherence, even from that sort of ethno-cultural point of view in the West. I would like to stress that also the success of the Western Church owes much to the way the Romans had organized the West. Or if you look at Italy, Spain, Gaul, partially also Britain, for how it will come to reactivate part of its urban centers, there is an intense colonization. There is an intense connectivity in terms of Latin literature and, in this sense, broader Roman legacy and culture. The Romans did not colonize much in the East, right? And and so what we're looking with the Byzantine Empire is a much more distinctively Hellenic or Hellenistic, even if you want, world that was already somehow quite different by the time the Romans had conquered it. And so you had truly very different blocks of peoples that are not even, in fact, very similar to the ones that rule from Greece. So to say, even though Greece is not per se just the center of the empire, there is much in, however, this broader Aegean, let's put it in this way, regional pool that sort of characterizes, identifies the Byzantine power and identity. But those were fundamentally Europeans. When you go further east, you find, again, other populations that also have other ecclesiastical traditions, even when they have, there's not much a matter of ethnic divide just per se, but indeed there's a very different worldview in Egypt, from Syria, from Armenia, etc. Now, while these imperial laws officially preserve the distinct local customs and different liturgical traditions of individual houses, they impose highly specific, rigid statutory demands on daily life. And this alone, if you consider it as a monastic reform, it's exactly the point you have to achieve uniformity, right? If you look at what Charlemagne did under Benedict of Aniane, the Western monasteries go under yet another reform, right, from the model of Saint Benedict of the 6th century. I would like also to stress, in fact, consider this is a very notorious topic in the history of monasticism, that were different spiritual and practical tendencies and forms of organization in the West. If you look at the Desert Fathers in the East, they had sort of very different attitudes than the ones sort of where the desertum was sowed in Western Europe. That desert in Latin is a neutral term, does not mean the dunes and the camels, etc. It means probably a solitude of some sort. And in the development, in fact, of monastic traditions is quite different, based probably on their liturgical regulations, right? There is already at this point an important divide between Eastern Christianity and Western Christianity, aside from this formal uniformity that, as you see here, Justinian was seeking, right, to impose. And again, the point of Byzantine autocratic tendencies is not much the fact here, as we will see, that they tried to impose them, but the fact that they had to begin with. So there's a precondition in the East that makes it more usual well, and viable, even though with its own challenges and limits as well, to impose a more autocratic rule as opposed to have a more spontaneous spiritual direction, and unitary one in particular. Under this legal framework, a single common dormitory and one shared dining hall were, for example, made mandatory for each communal house. Theologically, this mandate directly enforced the Christian ideal of koinonia, that is, communion, and the eradication of individualistic ideorhythmia, that is to say, the self-directed living. Forcing monastics to sleep and eat in shared spaces physically manifested the theological truth that salvation is a communal corporate reality achieved by mortifying the individual ego and learning to love one's neighbor in a functional, effective way, preventing the spiritual pride that often festers in hidden, privatized asceticism, right? And this also, to a degree, was fundamentally the point. The point is how communal these churches really are since the beginning. Not much, right? So you can argue, but look, in the Coloniac Reform, after all, there were these guys that were children of, some of the noblest people in Europe. They even when they fasted, they didn't eat meat. They had some cooks that in fact prepared for them some very fat fish, and so they lived this luxurious life even in the monastery. But you want to appreciate that in this sense, the Benedictine tradition was much more uniform and much more shared in the West without separation. Essentially, what different currents do you know in the West? The only one that has this initial sort of difference but remains very fringe by definition is the Celtic one that actually did contribute importantly to Western Christendom and monasticism, but that was fundamentally sort of absorbed by it was the exception that confirmed the rule. First of all, there was not a schism. There was not, the Irish brought in somebody also because they didn't probably have much to call there. Even when during the Viking era, there was a Gallo-Norse culture, this sort of the integrity of Western Christianity and even of Celtic monasticism was not really hit, was not what the point of it all really was. There is some of it, telling you the truth. If you look especially what was happening in Britain, there was the struggle over which kind of form, like the Celtic or the continental Roman standard, especially of ecclesiastical administration. There was, however, something slightly different from monasticism would have to be created. Eventually, obviously, the Roman model won, also because England, differently from the Celtic French, is a civilized place, or at least it became in comparison to surrounding regions, but especially like the Celtic one that had, after all, indeed the merit of partially evangelizing it, but because notoriously the Irish did not have cities. It obviously could not have, unlike the Easterners who had cities, even from before the Europeans had, so if you look back at the millennia, the Irish had developed their own monastic and episcopal tradition that overlapped, as you know, and there's part of this also in the Anglican tradition, where abbeys are, for example, a bit more important than in already during the Middle Ages, so before the Reform, naturally, in the Reformation to the continental one, and therefore, like, it was a different mindset, a different background. You had dioceses in monasteries, and so it was a very complicated and different story. But in that sense, you don't see, there is a German monasticism that is fundamentally different from, a Spanish monasticism, a French monasticism that is different from Italian monasticism. They are all fundamentally that, all right? And they work pretty well on that basis. In the East, you actually see how that Orthodox authoritarian vibe is there, because of course there was a correct effort, in fact, to uniform this multiplicity of churches, but the preconditions for this broader world to be unitary in a greater sense was much more difficult to affirm and to even to have to begin with. At this point in history, will always be a matter of sort of governability. This was true all across the social spectrum as well. In fact, the strict separation imposed to monks was not merely a matter of social property. It carried deep eschatological significance by carving out a space entirely removed from sexual differentiation and reproduction, for example. Monastics were meant to embody the angelic life, angelikos, bios, prefiguring the resurrection state where humanity transcends biological division and reproduces spiritually through virtue rather than physically through the flesh. Naturally, this is a sort of yet another matter. As you know, before the Gregorian reforms in the West, there wasn't this utmost, especially for the secular clergy, care for whether they had they had women in the sense that they weren't married, but they had children. In any case, this was completely normal up to a point. And of course, from a Christian point of view, at least for the end of that specific office, and also the contemplative life of monasticism, that I would like to stress are two very different things. We will see now also how and why monasteries created notoriously problems to a more civilizational. Monasteries were the heterodox fringe, right? Whereas the secular clergy was much more invested also in more direct governmental issues. Monks did participate to the seculum in many ways, because again, otherwise that monastic symbol could not be replicated from the rest of society. They had to be an example, but they also did live outside, right? And they were to ascetically sort of form themselves in a different context. Now, what I was saying is that Christianly speaking, for these specific roles, like being distracted by the world as a whole, depending on the degree also of sort of imposition of discipline and of commitment to sort of the theological interpretation at the end of the day, because this is left in Christianity also much to free autonomy, right? Entails that, of course, this kind of distraction is going to affect the spiritual quality of the monastic, in this case, the monastic experience, of the ascetic experience. The state also mandated a strict 3-year probationary novitiate period before any individual could bind themselves to permanent monastic vows, right? So higher standards for becoming a monk, and so having an important selection at the beginning. This obviously was an interesting measure that was trying to block like the entrance in monastic communities of sort of people, and therefore also ideas that would influence the same monastic community. They were not fit to it. They were indisciplined and so on. So we have never really talked about this on Schwerpunkt, but there were, in fact, many different types of monasticism, even in technically, there were already some congregations, if you want. There were some monasteries that followed the rule of this or that saint, that had obviously had also different monastic experience, life conduct. But there were many different monastic communities as far as properly the interpreted worldview was concerned as well. And this was threatening to the stability of the empire, right? This, of course, it was a level of uniformity, but given the level of heresy that we were explaining before being out there, it's obvious that if you have rampantly sort of gnostically tending monastic communities, these are going to spread ideas that are radically wrong. Right, we're not habituated to this because historically, Christianity successfully repressed these aberrations. Right, also even with Protestantism, at least you don't have probably monastic experiences either to ruin for that matter. And so basically, we're habituated to some pretty strict and controlled codes of conduct. At the time, it wasn't like that. At the time, the state had just so much power, capacity. The church had actually its own capacity and power. But at the same time, this is exactly the point we just made. Again, the various beliefs were so wildly separated in certain cases and opposite to one another that you can imagine what kind of mess would emerge from the most heretical areas or heterodox ones. And this had always been a problem. It had started in the East since ever. All right, starting from the Galatian. Like you have a a true, especially agnostic, like a Manichaean tendency, right? A dualistic threat there. And so the idea of policing society, right? Under Justinian regime, you have this sort of crackdowns enforced on many, again, institutions did not align with state ideology. You have sort of this rewiring in a much more somber, regulated fashion the entire Byzantine society and culture. Theologically, the limits imposed on monks or wannabe monks served to safeguard the gravity of the monastic tonsure, which was viewed as a second baptism or a lifelong covenant with God, and so was in the most sophisticated views of the of the religious men of the time, obviously be a path, an existence, an effort so important that the entire empire had to revolve around that. Probably these people had to contribute greatly in a contemplative point of view, spiritually, through prayer, etc., to the compaction of the empire. They had to be a model, again, for the rest of society. And so these measures were necessary. A premature vow, for example, risked the sin of spiritual apostasy. The 3-year delay ensured that the candidate's pro-heresis, the free moral choice, was thoroughly tested against the deceptive spiritual warfare of the passions before making an irreversible metaphysical commitment. Some people were too weak to be monks. Others entered instead in monastery with the idea that there would have been just a simple persecution of with secular life, things would have not really, nobody would have bothered really. Things would have not really changed. Right. Instead, at this point, great part of what you still see today, in fact, as an orthodox monastic vibe and identity, derives from this crackdown. This legislation also codified a rigid internal power structure as well. Without hierarchy, you couldn't get any order. All resident monks and internal administrative officers were forced into a state of total submission to the absolute authority of their abbot, for example, which sort of mirrors a bit that same Byzantine autocratic view of the world. Like the emperor was very detached, but sort of very above, right? In the West, there is this respect and reverence, etc., but there is also much greater dynamism and some greater sort of involvement also in the ad hominem affairs of the various monks. In the Byzantine world, you see this austerity, this rigidity, right? Consider that what the sovereign said in many ways was law, also for the church. So you can imagine how this power was transferred into the abbot, both from a secular, as far as sort of at least the human relations within the monastery were concerned, and not only, by the way, but also from a spiritual point of view alike, right? It's very integralistic in direction and in discipline. In the ascetic tradition, absolute obedience to the spiritual father, the Abba, is the primary weapon against philautia, that is, self-love, right? Which was considered the root of all sin and the cause of Lucifer's original fall, right? So some sort of narcissism, and the idea that you're just basically siding with yourself. You're selfish, you're egoistic. Instead, you have to annihilate it. We see it also in the Hermetic tradition. That was, of course, in part arriving to us thanks also to Byzantine monks that explained it from their own way, of course, that the first step towards the initiatic pact to heavenly nature is the dissolution of the self, right? And the rebuilding with the same material of a properly constituted one. This is extremely important. Again, I will be making more videos about Hermetic tradition, but you already know more or less, if you have followed me those episodes, what this is about. By surrendering their wills to the abbot, monks, in this sense, practice Christological imitation, mirroring the absolute submission to Christ to the Father, right? And so the highest self-sacrifice. However, the selection of this leader required a dual process of internal choice, fundamentally. So there was a communitary choice of the abbot as well, remember, and hierarchical oversight too. The abbot had to be chosen via a group election by a majority vote of the monks, which was then subject to the formal oversight and approval of the local regional bishop. Right? And remember that abbots and bishops do not really quite like each other very much. Like secular clergy looks at the monks as, again, this sort of more, this wilder, right? This more exotic, literally, community that does not have to deal with the more practical necessities of politics, of secular life, and more. Bishops, as you know, were involved also in, I don't know, in the defense of the cities. Sometimes monasteries were fortified, as still some of them are, due to sort of instability in different places. But in fact, at this point, you also have a much greater dependency of the monastery, in fact, on secular rule. These monasteries do not develop some kind of private power like in the West, right? This is going to happen fairly later. Of course, they had a great power themselves because, of course, a Byzantine monastery of the 9th century is very different from the one of the 6th. But in general, there was all that connection with the aristocracy and private resources, etc. But in the Byzantine world, monasteries are, at least at this point, very much under the control of a secular world. There is a distinct state with a specific head of it that is also the head of the church. So it's also fair to say that Justinian and his successors, and also his predecessors for that matter, deeply intervened in monastic fashions as well. So because some of the monastic institutions were the same cradle of many of those ideas that were then actually also more heterodox than the ones of different dioceses, even though the problem was pretty much ubiquitous in that regard, especially, as we were saying, in certain regions. And the emperor needed really to intervene, to put to an end to these issues. And some of these monasteries were also quite big and important, so if you managed to impose an abbot, say by political direction, things would, as it happened, really. This is also what the investiture controversy was fought over back in the day from us, but it had always been the same problem, the one of the two natures, and so Wu had to properly rule the world, by which kind of standards he had to be, or at least by whom his ambitiously divine standards had to be controlled, to be heading the right direction. So this dual process of election from the community of the monks and appointment by the bishops, as far as the abbot was concerned, balanced two distinct ecclesiological principles. The one of the community's vote, reorganizing the charismatic authority of the community itself, acknowledging that the Holy Spirit speaks through the collective body of the faithful, the consensus fidelium in the Latin way, while the bishop's approval preserved apostolic succession and systemic unity, ensuring the monastery remained an organ of the universal church rather than an isolated rogue sect. And in the East, they definitely had lots of those. That's why it was so urgent and imperative for Justinian to quickly regulate this. Naturally, this episcopal supervision was always there everywhere, also in the West, right? This, however, imperially aggressive political intervention by the 6th century state, alongside the watchful oversight of episcopal councils that we are still in the era of, as you understand, due to all the issues occurring in the Levant, was triggered by a deep unease within the ruling apparatus regarding the staggering variety and rapid proliferation of monastic guidelines across the Byzantine Empire, a phenomenon exploding even within the capital city of Constantinople, the thriving political, economic, and religious heart of the Byzantine realm, founded by Emperor Constantine on the site of ancient Byzantium, and strategically located on the Bosphorus Straits connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, a position that made it unparalleled in terms of trade and defense capacities for over a millennium. And that therefore already at the time had assumed that physiognomy that would allow itself, especially in these, to dictate such rule, right? It would appear like, okay, well, an emperor decides this monastic policy, right? But if you saw this from also the various Christian powers' perspective, how this was working, indeed, the Byzantine emperor had a very direct, decisive intervention. Before, when we talked about the Roman law, and so the Justinian law, you perfectly know that Frederick Barbarossa, that was subsidizing through the Constitutio Habitat, the Bolognese Studium, exactly to recover the civil law, was aiming at something fundamentally similar, orientatively similar to the Byzantine one, namely the reaffirmation of a fully imperial superiority over the Church of Rome. This in the West would never manifest because other forces would prevent this from happening. It was overall, I think, positive. As it wasn't positive that the relations between the papacy and the empire, also because of both faults to a degree, where all humans were concerned. But the broader point being that the Byzantine Empire began to treat its church, the monastic communities, etc., with some degree of pretty heavy authority. So much so that in the moments of greater difficulty of the empire, monasteries in the 7th century, monasteries would grow, especially in the peripheral provinces, as you know, very, very powerful. They would start actually absorbing what they had not managed to do prior. Consider these foundations were, in many cases, much older than the ones in the West. This is admittedly true, as you know, monasticism, at least in the strictly Christian sense, is because there was a level of monasticism actually in the ancient world, but people don't talk much about it. But in any case, this is spread from Egypt, from the Levant, broadly speaking, and eventually had been spreading through the Mediterranean, right? It arrived in Gaul. If you have the Lerins monasteries, one of the most important, then you have the rule of Saint Benedict, and all this in moments of great difficulty. Also, materially speaking, you have the Gothic War, the time of Saint Benedict. You have obviously the same Justinian pandemic that cripples further the entire world there. So even the spread of these monasteries, this phase under Justinian, in fact, is the last great expansive phase of late antiquity, right? And after that, the entire system sort of exhausts itself. And so before even bigger monasteries could develop or could be recovered by imperial standards, like it took, and that came parallel with Islamic invasion. It took really a while. So the Western ones gradually expanded across Europe, etc. And so you realize how power systems were profoundly anxious about the expanding independence and authority wielded by both these fixed monasteries and that already existed historically, especially in those eastern areas, and itinerant wandering hermits that were tendentially not the most orthodox figures around. Also in the West, there would be a problem with that, the pauperistic evangelical movements. If we look at the Franciscans for a while, they actually had some heretic fringes as well. It had to be properly disciplined. And they were the ones who preached, in fact, more openly a poor lifestyle. So there was always that necessity of reaching that extreme within a healthy Catholic view. But at the same time, this could more directly expose to that same sort of temptation of evil and of communism and of sort of turning this into bitterness as opposed to a positive, constructive way to still a hierarchically orderly world that had only to gradually imitate such spiritual endeavors based on sort of the current condition of mankind. For example, you realize that wandering hermits were outlawed by Justinian's laws strictly. This is extremely interesting. This was done in an effort to curb unregulated ascetic practices that could challenge centralized ecclesiastical and imperial control. And the fact that this had to be issued is quite significant because, you see, these were problems that, for example, the West never really had. Right? There wasn't a point, as we were saying before, in the West where, I don't know, there were some monks that went around and spread wrong ideas. This could happen, as we just said, within like sort of friars in particular social contexts that mostly had, is like we were saying before, like communistic tendencies. This is what the Cathars basically thrive across. And so it's the same world, right? And there's always a problem at some point with this wandering ideologues that create havoc with extremistic ideologies and so on. But that's also part of a sort of normal ideological picture, when in fact the French is well under check. Anyways, it happened with the Cathars, right, and other extremists. But at the time of Justinian, this seems a much greater territorial issue, right? Because of course there were heretics everywhere. We tend not to stress this, how much these ideas were truly out of control, and how in this sense, still in a broadly vast, fairly stagnating, but still remarkable late antique world, right, in spite of all its general declines and so on, the idea of sort of heretic individuals founding new monastic communities, right, based on sort of unproductive and potentially dangerous ideas was a legitimate concern, even from the side of the emperor, and or especially so, right? Again, what parallels do we have in the West? Pretty scarce ones, all right? Because it's not much, let's say in the West, heresy was not put down with the thing, like, now we are creating other monasteries. This never really happened, all right? There were similar instances, but society was also better organized for them not to quite take much rooting, right? In fact, we don't even know, as far as the Cathars are concerned, aside from the actual attempt to create a parallel hierarchy, literally copied from the Church of Rome, by the way, speaking of, what they really wanted to do, as modeling themselves after the papal monarchy, to actually take root in for example, in any more meaningful monastic sense, with orders, with congregations, etc. This was not a thing. We're talking obviously different times, but we're talking in fact a time in which, like in the 6th century, these groups were truly sanctioned instead by an imperial authority, and that evidently enough, there was much problem revolving around them. Such wandering ascetics, often called gyrovages in later traditions, were seen as potential sources of doctrinal instability and social disruption in an empire still recovering from earlier heresies and invasions at the same time, because let's not forget that these monastic ideas, in some cases, were also the vessel to some anti-imperial ideology. And so we all know how the Levant fell in the hands of the Arabs. And it's not much like, every sort of monastic community was actually accomplice to this. On the contrary, some survived and quite vexated, etc. But the general ideology that naturally had the local clergy and administration to open the gates to Muslims, Egypt in particular, was free enough, like obviously, to be unchecked even among monks. Theologically, the wandering monk was viewed as a spiritual anomaly, by the way. Orthodox spirituality firmly tied spiritual growth to the concept of xenithia, that is, the voluntary exile combined with the stabilitas loci in Latin, the stability of the place, right? Which is in fact something that in the West you actually get, right? There's a pretty sense, this is true also in Orthodox, a very strong sense of the monastic see, its traditions, its continuity. And so this idea of fixity that is in fact perennially inspired. And so like a wonder, of course, Christ did wander. And in general, the same monks did travel from monastery to monastery, but in this sense, there had to be a connective fabric that had already been established after hundreds of years of Christianity. The fathers of the desert are very old, right? So if you look at Antonius, Pachomius, and so on, like those were, here we are almost half of a millennium away from the earliest experiment of Christian monasticism. And so in this sense, there was already a pattern, a tissue, like a connective tissue of monastic tradition that sort of creating another one next to did not really seem really functional or sort of friendly towards the system. Also, and especially considering this was not really a time in which itinerant groups were endowed even with particular amount of wealth, of foundations of support, etc. So these were actual, sometimes even bands of martyrs. Like if you look at the Circumcellions, for example, they were not quite a monastic movement as such, but in late antique Africa, these were people who, in the name of a theological principle, were simply sort of sacking latifundia. They were killing, stealing, and this had been actually a big problem. Also, the mobs of the bigger Byzantine cities, in particular at this time, had remained quite unstable, right? Quite moved, but there were in the same Constantinople lots of heretical movements that threatened the stability of and the security of the city, right? So there was nothing to be kidded with. Like the Byzantines were taking care of this adequately, if you think about it. You understand also where that degree of repression in authoritarianism actually came from, but from a system that was already somehow prone to develop this tendency. To constantly move, in fact, meant fleeing from the hidden psychological demons of one's own heart. Right? This is how theologically the matter was seen, feeding instead the vice of acedia, the spiritual listlessness, and evading the correction of a stable community as well. That requires sacrifice, requires discipline, requires introspection. Right? The eternal wanderer is not really a great model. You have to stop at some point. This is good from an initiatic point of view. This was true in many ways because the obvious parallelism is also with the war band, right? The war band has, like the wolf pack at the lower tier, you're like an animal and you have to roam and to gain experience, etc. But as a wizard, eventually you have to establish yourself in a palace, in an Asgard, in something you have to defend and maintain on the basis of the wisdom that you have gained, right? So the Christian monastic experience was exactly based on the same way. Paradoxically, the secular impact and social weight of these ascetics grew immensely stronger the more they were viewed as completely detached from the world through their radical commitment to self-denial, prayer, and deep contemplation. The theological paradox of the holy man dictates that by achieving apatheia, holy dissipation, and cutting off worldly ambitions, the ascetic becomes a neutral, transparent vessel for divine justice, making them the ultimate moral arbiters and spiritual advisors to a society desperate for uncompromised truth. This is why it is all the more striking the unitary tendency and actual path that Western monasticism has since its beginning, right? With either highly qualified monastic institutions, probably in the later antique phase. We mentioned the Levant. We will make other videos about different other monasteries. But especially under the rule of Saint Benedict, the patron of Europe, that in this sense created a system that was eventually followed even in later times, where practically every monk was considered a Benedictine, even when congregations were born, and in fact a great effort was sort of carried out to sort of more correctly interpret his own rule, but without descending, in fact, into heresy, right? In the West, simply this does not exist. So you can't evaluate the value of asceticism on the basis of its fruits, obviously enough. Obviously the same, say, Greek Oriental asceticism had its own literal pillars, right, of light, right, and had set the standard for the Christian generations to come, right? But at the same time, you realize that by the 6th century, something in the East has gone wrong, and the state feels the need to regulate these phenomena because of the social unrest that they can actually cause. Now, for the highly educated elite residing within the monasteries, in any case, this life of isolated mediation did not mean intellectual stagnation. Rather, it fostered intense academic study and extensive literary production. And in fact, this is actually one of the moments in which Byzantine, or probably the peak of Byzantine civilization as such, like the Justinian era, like the period, the post-Justinian emperors, the immediate ones, are actually combining some of the greatest, right, Roman practicality with Hellenic effervescence, right, especially in intellectual endeavors. And so here we have a great tradition of Byzantine Orthodox mold that is actually thriving in those centers that were in fact designed specifically by the state to work successfully like this. And I would add, like, life was really hard at the time. That's why also I would like to talk more about monasticism, because there is always the perspective of, being withdrawn from the world, and always partially. All right, because these were not probably completely secluded communities. Actually, the female ones were completely. But overall, like, monasteries were fundamentally open. Monks did travel. They say that the community had to rely on these members that were also active in the councils, in the as advisors, even for imperial authority, etc. So there are levels of this. Obviously, the secular clergy is way more important. But as we've seen, the monks are also the successfully controlled ones are actually a pillar of the same system. They're controlled by the same imperial and episcopal direction. But living in this time, that was actually a pretty positive one for those who lived in the core lands of the empire, admitted. But especially speaking of the later generations who were less lucky and went through some horrifying things. But under the Saint Justinian, the plague that spread was already a terrible thing, and you could perceive that decline, that shrinking socially, culturally, by some degree. This was definitely happening. That the more, in fact, this autocratic grip was tightened, the more overall, for example, the province suffered of this. They were ever more centrally controlled, and fewer sort of systems, as we described before, sort of, there were still important centers in the east, for example, in terms of cities, but in terms of great urbanization, actually, the west was pretty similar, right? And in any case, the entire world was sort of fading from the classical era. And so living in a monastery provided you with some degree of material stability, right? In a core land somewhere in the Aegean, on some beautiful Greek island. Well, imagine just living there. It was, of course, very advantageous in many ways, especially if you were, again, intellectually versed and you would dedicate yourself to these studies with deep reflection and contemplation. The resulting intellectual output achieved a widespread, long-range radius of influence across the empire and beyond, preserving classical knowledge, theological writings, and spiritual texts that shaped later Christian thought. These are the same places where eventually the Latins in the High Middle Ages would travel, knowing that they hosted some important manuscript collections, right? And that at some point, also in the Byzantine world, as a consequence of this sclerosis, it stopped to circulate by the degree, instead by which, like, the West was now properly in control. Monks meticulously copied manuscripts of Greek philosophers, church fathers, and scripture in the scriptoria, ensuring the survival of works that might otherwise have been lost amid the empire's turbulent centuries. And this was known, again, across the world, that these were the centers of learning at some point that had produced this pretty important treasures in preserving ancient knowledge that eventually civilization would return to be in increasing need of. This preservation was fueled by a distinct theological worldview. Classical philosophy was often viewed as a preparatio evangelica, that is, preparation for the gospel, a fragmented revelation of the divine logos given to the Gentiles, which could be baptized and utilized to articulate complex Christian mysteries. Because these authors were shielded by the immense public prestige and aura of holiness that wrapped the monastic identity, they enjoyed a bluntness of speech, or parousia, and a readiness for public dispute that ordinary citizens living in the quote-unquote secular world could rarely afford within the normal unprotected frameworks of society. This is incredibly important because, again, if you were a monk within the sort of the orthodoxy and imperial protection, in some places you could risk your life even if you were of that kind. And there were many heroic monks that defended Catholicism in this sense in the heretic frontiers, and the they switch from Catholic to Orthodox because it means something. Again, if you don't know that, you can't make it up, by the way. You can't guess, right? But in this sense, like, just imagine being part of the mob, right? You're the fourth estate of Constantinople. Do you think that you live in a safe domain? You didn't, right? Only few select people had an actual protection. And the ones who were in this sense also already known, they were part of some specific clientele, institutions, and monks, the highest ones, at least, that the various communities could provide with higher quality, were notorious. They also risked their lives in many ways because, again, you always do. But you were protected by a circuit, by a net, right, of connections that ultimately arrived to the imperial palace. Now, theologically, the parousia that we just mentioned was the spiritual fruit of a restored relationship with God. Just as Adam spoke freely with God before the fall, the holy monk, purified of sin, possessed a divinely authorized boldness to speak unvarnished truth to imperial power, even without fear of earthly reprisal, because paradoxically, the same empire protected this level of autonomy. Right? They fostered the same monastic communities to the degree they could provide even this level of apparent debate. Right? In any case, when we say that the emperor controlled everything in an autocratic way, of course, it's not like they literally controlled literally everything. Of course, there were some monks that came even from some at different points, by the way. Even the patriarchs of Constantinople at some point went, as you know, against the emperor. So this was the norm in the general iron arm kind of, in fact, struggle, and still partially existing, in fact, competition between the Church and the Empire, in the Byzantine Empire, but in a much reduced way, which we are habituated in the West, and generally speaking, in fact, even with much less capacity, for example, of individual monks to simply make it. When we look at this age in particular, we look at still pretty populated cities before the plague, this big, in fact, fairly unstable, but sort of floating, stagnating system that can be agitated by this or that sort of doctrinal wave, right? But at the same time, like, this is still part of a system that increasingly considers itself as Byzantine. Now, this intellectual culture was a direct product of the monastic movement's demographics, attracting a significant number of well-educated individuals from upper estates and aristocratic, in fact, backgrounds who brought their rhetorical training, philosophical knowledge, and administrative experience into the ascetic life. Even while practicing strict self-denying asceticism, these high-born monastics maintained deep, enduring connections to the ruling estates of secular society and upper clergy. From the 4th century onward, the presence of these well-connected elites sparked a complex, intense, and ongoing dialogue between monastic communities, and especially the high-level hierarchy of the church. That was the other actor that was called into question. It wasn't just the emperor handling this. He delegated this to the church, and the church itself was secularly ruled by individuals that, as we've seen before, even from a social anthropological point of view, tended to disdain the monks per se. And that's why, in fact, the monk remained always like a fringe individual. You could not really fully expect what they were up to with their vision, what kind of ties they could have, even local. In fact, when you look at the iconoclasm, you know that this was the culmination of a moment of tension between imperial and monastic institutions, the latter of which had, in some cases, too much distance, autonomized themselves, and become like massive, also estates owner, at the fringes in certain provinces revolving fundamentally around these massive monasteries, and in ways that were also considered fairly superstitious, hence the problem with the icons that sort of would have allegedly transcended at that point veneration and turned into idolatry. But this is a completely different sort of debate that sort of pertains to the iconoclasm era and that here we're not touching. But this is for telling you how, as we said at the beginning, there is a trajectory across which you have to see this history, as any history, as a matter of fact. Nothing just belongs to the chapter on Justinian as far as, the Justinian word is concerned. Like, much came from before, and much that came after derived from it. And so you find a deeply important continuity. Also, in, again, systems that, as we know, if you look at pre-industrial societies, had tendentially changed very gradually, very slowly, even when there were major crises like the ones of the pandemic and the general contraction of late antiquity, etc. Like, the overall change of the system was sort of, in absolute terms, much smaller than the way our systems change in a matter of decades, right? Now, this powerful institutional dynamic, by the way, of relation between the emperor, the church, the monks, manifested in two highly visible ways. First, highly educated and articulate monks actively inserted themselves into the fierce, polarizing theological controversies that routinely divided the episcopate, such as debates over Christology and Trinitarian doctrine. Notably, the fierce struggles between Chalcedonian supporters of Christ's two natures and Monophysite emphasis instead on its divine unity, which threatened imperial unity, in fact, in the eastern provinces like Egypt and Syria, and that were fundamentally tending towards Gnosticism. And so when you look at those provinces, you realize that the entire worldview and what this fundamentally maintained was somehow even just giving way to an idea of a greater hypostatic divide, like the one existing in Islam eventually, where these places will fundamentally adopt, especially Egypt, regardless of sort of the Coptic Church surviving both provinces. But let's say even between these provinces, there were important changes in view. Even within the same provinces, like Antioch was very, very different from the Mesopotamian frontier historically, right? And in the latter, in fact, you have those more fractal and sort of heterodox fringes, not just of the monks, but of the church itself. Now, monks, we will have to make videos about this, because I think never really made a video about monophysitism, or at least what happened in places again like Egypt and Syria during this period. But we're talking a massive issue, especially for an empire that sought properly ecumenic control, right, over lands where the same monasticism had been born fundamentally. So monks viewed these dogmatic battles not as mere semantic politics, obviously, but as cosmic struggles for human salvation. If Christ's dual natures were compromised, or if his true divinity or humanity were obscured, the ontological link bridging God and creation would snap, invalidating the entire economy of salvation. So obviously, this position was highly defended by the Orthodox in a Catholic sense, meaning truly that what's at stake here is the integrity of the world empire as such. And again, that's why the link there with also Islamic invasions and success in these provinces is actually very poignant. And I made actually a video, I don't remember whether it was the one about Hippolytus's prophecy, but there was something that I made about the Byzantine church that sort of explains what happened also to the monastic community, not just to the obviously the secular communities of the church, that's the Christian church that survived in Islamic held lands, but also the monks that survived in places like Syria in particular. Now, next to this, you have also the institutional church, in fact, increasingly relying on the monastic ranks as its primary recruitment pool for selecting new bishops. This is very interesting because, again, tendentially, in the history of civilization, these are two different paths, right? But especially when monastic education was considered particularly elite right? It was considered as part of a cursus honorum. This happened, for example, also in the Latin world with the aforementioned again Lerins monastery, that, as you know, is on these islands that are in front of Cap d'Antibes, where Napoleon landed eventually from the Elba exile, that were fostering, in fact, this monastic ascetic experience that was required for eventually accessing properly the Archbishopric of Arles, that had been, as you know, the prefecture of gold and therefore we're talking actually first of all some of the strongest pools of Romanity existing in the West. This is radical. This is the same levels of Italy historically, Southern Gaul, but also one of the most traumatic, at that point likely the highest level of ecclesiastical education, culture, literacy, like overall. By the way, we're talking the mid-5th century even, so we're talking not just, when the empire still existed nominally, places like those, Marseille, etc., would always remain connected with also the Byzantine Empire later on, but as also part of the Latin part. So never equivocate Byzantine as a sort of purple blob, like in a paradox game that you say, oh, this is actually part of the... No, it's sort of a much deeper ecumenic spectrum. But in that sense, we're talking some of the highest cultural levels in the world at that point, and it requires, in fact, this very specific level of also ascetic preparation. And the Lerins, that is only a few hundred kilometers away, right? So again, we absolutely must make way more monastic history videos because we are missing a huge part of the history of Christendom. It's not like we haven't discussed them, but again, there's really much more, right? And so in the Byzantine Empire, you have, for the most exclusive monasteries in particular, this same kind of dynamic, right? Together with educational standards, as we were saying before, culture, etc. This shift eventually responds also to the needs of being actual. It's a bit like saying when the mendicant orders became the top theologians in the age of scholastics and of the peak of medieval civilization. This had been the underdogs historically, but they managed to become, in fact, more educated and powerful, even some bishops. And so in the Byzantine Empire, why? Because as we were saying before, also drawing a parallelism between, in fact, the two times and places, urban spaces were ever more affected by these doctrinal debates. And so you needed, people who were able to speak to the crowd from that level of spiritual charisma that monks had, that bishops were probably not as something way more tied to secular office, right? In imperial direction were supposed to do. Also because they were not supposed really to, in that sense, to mix with the people, right? The bishops, if you think about the Patriarch of Constantinople in particular, they were the metropolitic sees, you have Antioch, you have Alexandria, you have Jerusalem, then Rome, obviously enough. But let's say you have specifically like a height that, as we said before, cannot be gapped, right? Between a divide properly between bishops, archbishops, and the people. Whereas these monks, at least, that become that, and so they rise to that level, however, had previously been known at a more popular level, and also as debaters, etc. So it's a very important change. It's actually not a positive one, if you think about it, because it meant that in some cases, this especially was the case for the Byzantine Empire, the level of radicalization in debate had increased with all those heresies. In fact, the West here does not really apply for that. In part, also because those monks of the Lerins, for example, were themselves children of the great senatorial house. This was not the case for the Byzantine monks. Also because the Byzantine Senate was also something, as we said before, administratively artificial, created by the emperor. Of course, there were many powerful people. They were at some point also becoming educated, sort of aristocratic in their ways, etc. But they had a fundamentally different sociocultural history from the ones, for example, of the great learned senatorial episcopal families in the West. Now, the aforementioned shift, namely the fact that bishops mostly came from a secular career, but were appointed from that secular path, as opposed to instead coming now from a ascetical monastic one, like in origin. Let's say this shift again institutionalized the theological ideal that the governance of the church should not be handed to career politicians, as some bishops were also legitimately seen by the Greek, but to pneumatophoroi. So in Greek, this is a term meaning spirit-bearing elders who had conquered the passions and could govern the flock with prophetic, non-worldly wisdom. From pneuma, that is sort of the vital breath of God, and phoroi means, as you know, also from Hellenistic military units, those who carry this, like in Pharaoh, after all, Indo-European languages are so close to one another. Interestingly enough, like this is again a fundamental degradation of some sort. It's some sort of populistization even of the Byzantine ecclesiastical career. This, needless to say, happens more often in the heretic-dominated provinces, right? That, in fact, in the various metropolitic sees, and so the apostolic centers were taken over by these radicals, and in part had, in fact, stemmed from these more local, sort of eccentric monastic traditions. And as you understand, this is very interesting because it's an entire socio-political phenomenon. You can't read this through a map even. This also drove the exceptionally rich and vibrant development of Byzantine monasticism for a full millennium until the empire's fall in 1453, as it remained, even with the loss of the eastern provinces, as being structurally powered from late antiquity by the blending of Eremitic and Basilian traditions alike. Right, the Eremitic path obviously emphasized solitary withdrawal for unceasing prayer, providing the raw prophetic fire of the desert, which is essentially how you should reignite your divine conqueror, or your divinely expansive soul when confronted with the abyss that the desertum provides. While the Basilian communal models, inspired by the 4th century Cappadocian bishop St. Basil the Great, who served as bishop of Caesarea and Cappadocia in Central Asia Minor, authored the influential Asceticon, or monastic rules promoting a balanced life of prayer, manual labor, charity, and community living, and as is often called the father of Eastern monasticism, right, an equivalent to St. Benedict, essentially, for the West, providing probably systematized guidelines, right? And these areas are sometimes producing even such great minds, exactly because they emerge from places where they were fundamentally challenging from a theological point of view. Some very famous and influential churchmen that would greatly contribute to informing Christian thought, but will also be condemned exactly in the age of Justinian. And this is the case of Origen, right? If you were wondering in particular, some of you already know this, but it's really interesting because some of these ideas were considered heretical, and for this reason, like, also banned some of his works. But a great part of his works were actually destroyed at this point under Justinian. But he had been incredibly influential, and in this sense, he was one of the main Christian voices from sort of the eastern part of the empire that had, therefore, in any case, been incredibly sort of at the root of the thinking, from a positive or critical point of view, of many other great thinkers. And so you have, in fact, in these same monastic institutions, right, of the Basilian, right, and Eremitic tradition, the Origenian influence, right? You have Origenian, post-Origenian mystical theology that informs them, drawing from the influential 3rd century Alexandrian thinker, Origen. It was allegorical scriptural interpretations that are never fully allegorical, by the way, emphasizing the soul's gradual purification and ascent towards divine union through contemplation, the theory and cosmic vision of restoration, the apokatastasis, profoundly shaped later contemplative practices across the East. In fact, also finding this fertile ground because they were in and of themselves heterodox ideas at the best. And even as some of his more speculative ideas, in fact, on the pre-existence of souls, faced later condemnation at councils like the one in 553 under the very Justinian. So you understand it was difficult for the coercive means of that time. Doesn't matter how powerful Justinian was and how well sort of structured his church and monastic net really was, to control ideas. To control, for example, the circulation of writings, even though they made their best to burn these Origenian ones. And in this sense, some Eastern churches had probably been molded within already that historical influence and pneuma that we've seen these authorities were seen as maintaining. This is also fairly different from the Western attitude to monastic spirituality, because aside from the fact that there were important thinkers, obviously continuing, this is true also in the Byzantine world, obviously, but to produce, to inquire. In the West, if you look at the influence of Augustine, it will be dominant. For example, of course, like he wasn't a monk, but he also, for example, was influenced by the Manichaean Oriental heresies, etc. But you realize that the attitude of the Westerners is more, let's say, critical in a positive sense. I mean, there are ideas, we study them, but we don't need to go astray or to consider like this or that authority, oh my God, there is only this one, we should simply, side with him or with another, because simply in the West, there isn't even that struggle between different spiritual directions, right? Aside from the fact that we didn't mistake, in that sense, heretics for fathers of the church, as a matter of fact. So, and this is quite fascinating, because if you look at St. Paul or St. Augustine, indeed, like also later Protestantism would draw many ideas from them, because these were already relatively edgy, right? But they weren't effectively heretical as well. And so while there is always a liminal ambiguity that is supposed to be there for leaving free will at work in Christianity and Catholicism, you realize that probably the social-cultural attitude of the West was completely different from one of the East, right? It was more patheticistic, right? It was more based on this example and this kind of more nomadic following and sort of reconstitution of different movements and rebranding different ideas and going sort of completely eccentric with heterodox and heretical unorthodoxy, however you want to call it. Now, theologically, Origenism, for example, provided the foundational roadmap for theosis, deification, which, as you know, is fully integral to Catholic ideas, importantly enough, framing the monastic life in this sense as an intellectual and spiritual ascent wherein the soul sheds its material attachments to become completely illuminated by divine light. Except Origen went as far as saying that basically you weren't even properly resurrected in the body. It was taking directly some Platonic ideas where you were resurrected as a ball of sort detached from your mortal coil. So remember, this is what, if you look at monophysitism, right, does it remind you anything? Like this is exactly the problem. This system was theologically, spiritually, intellectually skewed since the beginning. It was a deeper social cultural issue. The same one that was not able to accept the empire, to see these individual elements within a constitutive empire. And by the way, elements that didn't even have an alternative to that. This is not just like a part of the empire who wants to be the empire. This is what probably want to secede, want to destroy, which is very different from, I don't know, like all the wars that were fought at times against emperors in the West that were not absolutely remote or even remotely aimed at eliminating imperial authority, or even more at sort of actually going heretic in the process, right? So something similar exists again with the Cathars that sometimes are backed by, sometimes the Pope, even I've seen in Patharia, sometimes by the emperor, but they're very contingent things that they do not give way to any kind of theological alteration in canon law, in nothing, right? So there aren't subversive currents that, I don't know, the nobility joins them. Pope and emperor and all secular authorities were incredibly cooperative in destroying these aberrations. I mean, even the heretical Valdensians were perfectly okay with the extermination of the Cathars, even as they were being persecuted by Rome as well. So you have in the West a much more sort of unitarily, cohesively established spiritual life that shows through the centuries. Also because literally the Byzantine emperors will start backing some borderline heretical doctrines in ways that will try to salvage orthodoxy but fail fundamentally just to remain control of the East, whereas again the West, as we explained, did not fundamentally indulge in such heterodoxy at all. And so this is also quite relevant because we described here Byzantine autocracy as stressing orthodoxy, yes, but did they end up actually backing heterodox or heretical movements? Yes, and they created for this reason also a big backlash at home, so to say. So in the European part, or at least the more western part of the empire, meant sort of not eventually those lands that will lose in the Levant, because in fact there was an awareness that those ideas were right. This never really happened in the West. In the West, you don't find that. You find, I don't know, things like Pelagianism, but we're talking a single guy from Ireland that came up with ideas that were wrong. The episcopate said it's wrong, and nobody, heard of that again, right? There were ideas that will, like Manichaeism and dualism as such, reemerge throughout the centuries all across the board, and this happens actually also in other cultures, in other religions, in other parts of Eurasia. But this is not because the same hierarchy was so sort of insecure of its grip that had to start to increase autocratic power, but also at the same time flirting with heresies. Right? This happens only in the Byzantine Empire. In the West, there's none of this. Right? It's not a matter of opinion. It's just macroscopically the case. If you have any idea of ecclesiastical history, we shall make conciliary history as well, because the history of councils, not just the ones that the so-called ecumenic ones in the East, are crucial to explain how, in fact, these matters were handled, in fact, in the West. A more fragmented West, at least in terms of metropolitic number of sees, but exactly as we were saying before, still under Rome and with this regional autonomy that did not produce heresy. It was in perfect line with Rome. It was definitely not also siding with the Byzantine shenanigans, siding with the monophysites, the monothelites, etc. So there is monoenergy. There are different kind of issues that lead also to different schisms at some point with the West at that point, because the West also under Arian Germans said, no, all right, we side the papacy. You can't do this stuff. And as we said on other occasions, again, there was nothing that Arianism could actually, unlike in the East, this is very interesting. In the East, Arianism had been a real issue theologically. In the West, no. In the West, it was just an international identity. There was no room for theological development of any of that. Now, the historical catalyst for the initial expansion of this movement, by the way, occurred during the 4th century, running entirely parallel to a profound ethical crisis that shook the core of the Christian community following the Edict of Milan in 1313, issued jointly by Emperor Constantine and his co-emperor Licinius, which granted full tolerance and restitution, as you know, property to Christians after decades of brutal persecutions under emperors like Diocletian, ultimately paving the way for its eventual establishment to Christianity's establishment as the favored religion of the empire by the late 4th century, and the official one with Theodosius in particular. This moral decline emerged precisely at the historical moment when Christianity transitioned from its original status as a persecuted minority faith into the state's favored, privileged, and dominant religion. Under the weight of institutional success, the daily conduct of ordinary believers rapidly deteriorated into a compromised lifestyle that was distinct from traditional secular existence only in its outward ritualism and attendance at new liturgical services. Consequently, the urgent eschatological expectation, the vivid theological reality that this world is passing away and the kingdom of God is imminently breaking through, and the spiritual tension that had vibrantly defined the dangerous era of martyrdom died out. In a way, there is more resignation, right? The idea of sort of the end time is still alive, but it comes more out of, as you know, the awareness of a struggle, right? And so there are different ways, in fact, different parts of Europe and Mediterranean see this as far as how does that happen technically. Is it more something you have to messianically expect, or is something that you have to contribute to? Right. And so there are very different positions and also very different influences by other religions in that. Judaism, as you know, has sort of a different attitude compared to Christianity in that sense, but also Eastern Christianity has a different attitude than the West to this. And we'll talk about this better perhaps in another video, because again, the level of self-actualizing theosis that the Latin Germanic world asserts in the Middle Ages is something that doesn't quite live in the East, right? Even in the best of expectations, even though theosis is always there in Christianity and Orthodoxy preserve that. In any case, when the state ceased to execute Christians, just to talk about this prior era now, we're going back compared to Justinian, the church faced the terrifying threat of internal secularization, right? Trading its radical countercultural identity for worldly comfort and imperial privilege. It was precisely this spiritual decay and watered-down compromise of gospel teachings that triggered a quiet radical rebellion among the original monks. At least this can be interpreted like this. The way it actually went is that, of course, the church had to take now on enormous responsibilities that before had not, right? And so actually, the problem of salvation was transposed at much higher levels. The Roman Empire in and of itself was now fully backed in a political sense by the church. We've seen how the church had actually always backed the empire. There's never really a moment in which it says that the empire should not be or whatever. The important was for emperors to convert to Christianity and to allow this freedom of conscience as far as sacrifice to what Christians thought to be a non-God. And so at that point, in a Christian lens, the idea is that the emperor was instead tendentially also to be seen partially divine. This is also another theological issue that, in fact, partially should, as an adverb, should explain everything. But let's say, for a reason, for a purpose, we said it at the beginning, Christianity had come about exactly because theosis was now seemingly out of range of the actual human types that held the world, let alone the rest of the masses, right? But it is true that some monks felt sort of betrayed by the idea, and this is a populistic concept, frankly, that sort of the hierarchies of the church had compromised themselves with a higher temporal power. And so you find that level of heterodoxy, fringe mentality, of counterculture in monasticism. And that's also why the secular clergy does not like monks, because monks remained in many ways at that lower level in a general sense. And especially in these, tended to criticize that connivance with the state, because it was an expedient for the local church, heretical churches, to basically break out from the empire, right? In the West, this does not quite happen like that, right? It was a reaction to the fall of late antiquity. There was a sense of sort of detachment, if anything, from temporal matters that also relatively quieted down in the early Middle Ages compared to the previous centuries. And so there is a more, sort of a less conflictual development of monastic power with the episcopal one, right? For what we see. It's not like it did not exist, but it's not comparable to the complexity and conflictuality that we see in the East. Now, outraged by the laxity around them, these early ascetics withdrew into solitary hermitages or communal settings, resolutely determined to recreate the exact, uncompromising conditions best suited to imitating the life of Christ and reviving the radical purity of the original apostolic church. In their eyes, monasticism was the continuation of martyrdom by other means. Where physical martyrdom shed blood for Christ, monasticism was a white martyrdom, so to say, a daily bloodless dying to the world, crucifying the carnal desires to witness to the reality of the coming kingdom. And obviously this was mostly carried out with the intention of theosis, right? The idea that, the more you reach the extreme, and the abyss, the more that divine spark in you can ignite and take over. And so hence also sainthood and a partial accomplishment in heavenly achievement as far as the life and influence of these men was concerned, right? And this is true pretty much everywhere, right? That's the point of monasticism in many ways. It's mostly contemplation. Then you have the monastic military orders, that it's a mix of both. And so that was probably the most complete form, at least in average, in the systemic outcome, but not quite in the sense that you couldn't achieve contemplation, salvation through contemplation, and in the sense that theosis, it's more through just sort of an inner work, and this is more difficult indeed, and that's why also monks expose themselves to this greater difficulties. It wasn't mere contemplation; it was probably a struggle of the flesh. This happens especially in the frontiers, in fringe areas. Celtic monasticism, for example, is incredibly brutal. Right? It reaches levels of de facto torture in order to impose discipline. I see baths, like especially in places like Ireland, that are not some of the warmest in Europe. And you can imagine sort of the deeper connections that existed also with prior means of initiatic cults, and that how this rites that were in fact literally competing, at least in that tribal case, with the local Gaelic military practice as well. In fact, in Celtic hagiography, you find a big deal of this confrontation between the classical hero, the warrior, whereas, in the Levant, it's all another story. It's more just like a pushing you towards the extreme in an individual sense. Think about the Stylites and how this was a way of achieving that. It works. It does belong to the same objective, the same posture, right? So it's not like there was a wrong answer, but it depended also on the times, and also on the fact that these different practices were in fact different from people to people for evidently a prior predisposition in history. But if we look properly at the origin of this, we see this response, this rejection of the world, even way before Christianity was even allowed to be a licit cult. Remember that Christianity was persecuted, but it was intermittently so, right? It was full of Christians everywhere. Most of the times, Roman Christians had nothing to fear. They participated to the army. It was not probably a problem for them to do so. Never in a geography it's about shedding blood as a problem, being a soldier. The point was all about essentially sacrificing to the emperor, recognizing that as God, or not better. And so that's really another story. So it's what you can achieve through a radical spiritual cure, which the Christians thought, this world thought, that the Roman Empire had fallen from, because it was the world empire. In any case, mankind was to degenerate, and this started occurring to the point that the control and the previous means of achievement, of conquest, etc., was fundamentally lost. Right? Nobody could simply take that path, and that's why Christ had come about. So this incumbent sense of death, right, of at least attempt to escape from mortality, was, for example, beautifully exemplified by figures like Saint Anthony of Egypt in the late 3rd and early 4th centuries, as the pioneering desert father, in fact, born around 251 in the same country, whose dramatic withdrawal from the same Egyptian wilderness near the Nile River battles with demonic temptations, vividly described in Athanasius's influential Life of Anthony, such a graphical work, and solitary asceticism inspiring countless followers across the East. Anthony's retreat demonstrated the theological concept of entering the desert to engage in hand-to-hand combat with cosmic demonic powers. If you don't expose yourself, if you don't risk, you can't get there. You can't see the world in the way it deserves. In this sense, demonic powers reclaiming the fallen creation for the lordship of Christ. So you understand also how this was eventually embraced in a fully imperial idea, because these were the people who were trying through that path to achieve it. It was incredibly important for the spirituality of the time. We could and would do that, right? The entire geography is also truly expressing a level of spiritual highness that was challenging the same military power that the imperium as a redeeming force had historically been seen up to that point to be, at least in its normal exercise, the carrier of redemption and salvation. And so there was an enormous prestige, an enormous power that a geography itself expresses as a literary production, mirroring the power of the church, the power of this monastic traditions, the sort of martyrdom in particular. Martyrdom obviously is referring to the idea of being able to see God, right? So being a witness to that higher nature that can't be accessed in the lower realm. And this solitary warfare in the desert seemed to be, in fact, one of the most effective. It's obviously expressed in the Gospels as such, as Christ performs that, and it was later organized by Saint Pachomius, a former soldier turned monk born around 292 in Upper Egypt. In fact, you have this other very interesting trend, not just the imitation of Antony in many ways, but the fact that soldiers themselves, we've seen it in the video about St. Martin of Tours, as a matter of fact, it was an elite cataphract of Julian's Schola Palatina. It's as if a Navy SEAL, or even more than that in proportion, chose that specific path and deciding to be able to fight without weapons, right, and achieving that as well, like Christ achieved the world by full self-sacrifice. And Pachomius founded the first major cenobitic communities around 323 at Tabenese along the Nile, establishing structured monasteries with shared rules for labor, prayer schedules, obedience, and common meals that emphasize communal discipline and as essential bulwarks against worldly corruption and individual spiritual pride. Pachomius' model realized the theological vision that the Christian life is fundamentally a restoration of the Edenic state, a harmonious coexistence where human beings united in perfect love and obedience could visually manifest the life of the Trinity on earth. Right? So that monastic principle of like the point of conjunction between heaven and earth, and therefore the full realization of universal salvation. And so, like, it's videos like these that we should make a bit more, because I have actually a playlist on Orthodox. Let me check, because we recently, as I said before, made a video about Byzantine Church, and we obviously, yes, medieval Greek Orthodox Church. And this is not so big as a playlist, but it received a fair amount of views. We'll continue naturally making videos on this topic because it's an evergreen actually, and I have also pretty hefty Justinian era playlist that testifies to the truly ecumenic scale of this era and issues before the end of late antiquity, right? Transformation of late antiquity, how you want to call it, right? So what else to say? Well, speaking these topics is not easy because you have from one side to look at the institutions, you have to look at the theology of it, what role the church really had, how there are different fractions within the same, how there is obviously a general sense of complexity of all the individuals that come about. And so it's never easy. It's never complete. Like it requires this very gradual work, just like, I don't know, a monastic work, so to say. And I think there are naturally very important things we still have to look at. But I guess on Schwerpunkt we are on the right track to amplify this content and to adequately contextualize it in the multitude of videos we've already made in Christian history, right? It always feels on Schwerpunkt like we haven't made enough. I say it every once in a while, or actually often, and it's unavoidable, right? If you're trying to cover everything here, just like several videos on medieval Orthodox Church, it's sort of too few, right? We haven't covered this for most of the various churches. At least we talk about the evangelization era during the early Middle Ages. We looked at sort of certain dynamics that definitely are sort of mirroring what we said today in part, and that, as we said before, are the product of this Justinian era. Sort of the Origenian influence on the Hermetic and Basilian world in the Byzantine, but it's quite interesting and also burdensome mix that you have to be able to districate yourself from. We also don't know everything that we would like to know about the actual life of these monks and how organized they were, or at least especially what kind of political ambition they had. There are some. I knew one of the very few, I don't know, specialists in 7th century monastic literature history, and he complained. This was a professor of Byzantine history back in the day, who complained that people like him were snobbed by Grecists, by classicists who said, derided him that he would study not ancient, probably classical Hellenic, but the Greek, the medieval Byzantine Greek, and even on top of that, of the quote-unquote Dark Age 7th century monastic, and even the guy he eventually picked to research was one of the most obscure figures ever. But just for telling you that there is actually room for that, and that when you have passion, he was actually a pretty good professor, I must say. He was even able to teach proper history because he taught us a history course, even though he was a historian of literature. That is something very different. But he exemplifies it. As you know, I had all the possible Byzantine history classes at university that I could. And he showed us, even as a human type, like what kind of sort of relevance these things really have, because all this history speaks of a specific inner spirituality, tension, and mechanisms that are pretty ubiquitous, right? on this channel, like the bias is Catholic, and we push back obviously against those attempts of neo-orthodoxism, just edgy, sort of mentally challenged people who, without a consolidated prefrontal cortex that want to act as if they found a new spirituality. They don't know anything about history to begin with, nor about religion, about nothing, right? Let's be honest. Like most people today, literally have no clue about whatever topic is going to be addressed. But let's say, obviously, Orthodox civilization carries a very important sort of legacy that must be understood, even in fact in its fundamental shortcomings. And I mean, I think in front of Catholicism, there is not really much to explain. And this is very interesting, again, because they were originally both Catholic and Orthodox. In fact, the official name of the Orthodox Church is Catholic for a reason. And Catholicism presented a model that I think is unchallengeable, right? And it is truly the highest expression of a truly Catholically meant theological, in the sense of universal idea, right? Because if you have, like in Orthodoxy, like a church that are just supine to an imperial rule that is not able to maintain order to begin with, like was the emperor really truly succeeding in divinizing? Yeah, you could understand, and that's the role of the church, submitted to that. But if it doesn't succeed in that, right? What does the emperor do? Like, if what the church has to do if the emperor fails in his own duty. Like, the church must be hierarchically structured, but also must be autonomous to the degree the emperor fails. And in that sense, the Byzantine church did not successfully prop up Byzantine civilization as it was declining. And we all know what happened in Byzantine history, not just the end, say 1204 or 1453, but 1204 should be reconsidered a little bit, because it's actually the most important in these steps, and it came out of a specific reason, of a specific expansion of Catholic civilization. What had happened in the previous centuries, regardless of the ups, right, was eventually not enough. And what one must explain that. So again, it's all a crucially interesting history that we must be able a bit to reconsider in historical terms, both accurately and objectively, because this is the worst part of this all, that it's the factionalism of the debate that spoils the validity of the same, the heuristic value, the positivity of the same. These videos may be intricate and complicated to follow, but I hope that obviously they can address topics that so far not just we hadn't touched on Schwerpunkt, but can be of interest and that are not quite debated in these perspectives nowadays. I think, however, that for today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.